Hey guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. If this is your first time here, you are in for a doozy of a video today. We are talking about the concept of the dark night of the soul. Now, this is a concept that predominantly comes from kind of ancient spiritual and philosophical traditions, but that's been interpreted by a lot of different psychologists as the years go on. So this video is less straight up contemporary psychology and more a blend of philosophy with psychology over the ages. So one of the people who spoke about the dark night of the soul is Carl Jung, who is someone we were also discussing recently on this channel in a video that I made about shadow work. So I will link in the description of this video the link to that video, because if the term shadow work is new to you, you might want to go give that a watch first, just so you have some context for what we're talking about today. So once again, the dark night of the soul is a concept that many different spiritual teachers have tackled over the years. And my favorite concise definition from it comes from Eckhart Tolle, who describes the dark night of the soul as a collapse of the perceived meaning in life. So the dark night of the soul is what happens when we are forced to confront our shadow, which means confronting and reconciling with all of the parts of ourselves that we have consciously disidentified with. What this leads to is a crisis in identity. And we're going to talk more about what this looks like in the middle of this video. But essentially, when we face our shadows in a true sense, what we're doing is realizing that all of the things we perceive to be deeply flawed or morally wrong with other people or the world also exist within us. And not only do those things exist within us, but we have been unconsciously playing them out by virtue of the fact that we have been repressing them and causing pain to ourselves and others in a way that goes against our own conscious moral code. So this leads to a crisis in both our self-identity and our sense of meaning, because we all understand and navigate the world through a moral code that we internalize, for most of us, from a very young age. We just add more sophisticated language to it as we grow up. We learn to identify certain things as good and certain things as bad, and we act in alignment with that which we perceive to be good on a conscious level and repress any impulses we have that we perceive to be morally bad on an instinctual level. So for the majority of our lives, our sense of self-awareness is really an observation of our ego. So the parts of our minds and our self-concept that are conscious to us and that we are aware of. That's what we tend to be thinking about when we're analyzing the self. When we are doing shadow work, we start to become aware of the fact that the ego is not the only part of who we are. And in order to proceed through the dark night of the soul and arrive on the other side where we have integrated what's in our shadow, it is necessary for our systems of meaning and morality to kind of collapse in on themselves, and for us to eventually be able to expand our view of both ourselves, other people, morality, and the nature of reality. So again, we're gonna get more into that as the video goes on. But for now, what I wanna talk about is how this relates to attachment. So I believe that if we are doing attachment work, and I mean like really doing attachment work, not just trying to find a few tools here and there for making our relationships healthier, we are by definition doing shadow work, because what it means to be insecurely attached is to be psychologically one-sided. So to be leaving large swaths of relevant information about attachment relationships out of our conscious awareness, whether that means information about ourselves and how we're showing up, which might go instinctively into a blind spot, or information about how other people are impacting us and vice versa. So I think that if you are deeply taking on the process of attachment healing work, it is extraordinarily likely that you will encounter the dark night of the soul at some part in this process. To be doing true attachment healing work is to be doing shadow work. So let's take this kind of back to the absolute basics and spend a little time getting a grasp on why attachment healing work is so tied up with that which we might consider spiritual in nature. And when I say spiritual, I do not mean religious. What I mean when I say spiritual is our individual and collective relationships with that which we do not understand. So with the kind of existential void that is what happens before and after life. All of us have to find ways of grappling with the fact that we are mortal, that we and everyone we love will someday die, and our attachment relationships are deeply intertwined with how we process that information. So when we are infants, our primary attachment figures, which is whoever our caregivers are are the people who are responsible for managing our relationship with our own existence. And this is true both in a literal sense, so it's our parents' jobs to make sure that we are fed and that we aren't falling off any high pieces of furniture that we've managed to climb up, but they are also responsible for managing our relationships with existence and the concept of death on an emotional level. So here's what I mean by that. When you are a baby and you feel something like pain or hunger or extreme discomfort that you don't understand in your body, the only thing you can do is show your emotions and hope that somebody is going to come along, competently assess what you need, and give it to you. So you feel this kind of existential distress creeping in, and the way that your parent most often responds when you express feelings that arise from a place of existential distress or anxiety sets the stage for how, as an adult, you will deal with the same feelings. Now, as an adult, we experience existential distress quite a bit less often than babies do, at least on a conscious level. For most of us, not all, but most of us, we are not in daily fear of dying. But what does tend to trigger feelings of existential distress are things like perceiving loss. So imagining that we might lose someone we love, either to death or to some sort of rupture in the relationship. That we might lose a thing we love, like a job or a particular time period in our lives that we're really happy in. There are little deaths that are very inherent to being alive, and our attachment orientation determines how we are going to cope with those losses when they come up. So if I have a secure attachment system, because as a baby, when those existential threats arose for me, I was more often than not met with the appropriate response within an appropriate time period, I'm likely to have a fairly relaxed relationship with existential distress as an adult. So when something in my life is coming to an end, when a friendship is ending, when I am moving somewhere, when someone I love dies, I know how to access the true pain of what is happening, and I know how to soothe myself around it and or lean on the people around me to get through that distress. But if we had to develop an alternative strategy for managing our existential distress as babies because our caregivers were not adequately responsive to us in one direction or another, it's highly likely that the strategy we developed for either mitigating our own distress or amplifying our own distress in order to elicit protection and comfort from others, those strategies end up becoming our system of morality as we grow up. So if you are a young child and the only way you can communicate is through sharing your feelings, and you learn that sometimes I get responded to appropriately when I share my feelings of distress, but other times my caregivers don't seem to notice or seem to take a very long time to attend to me, what you learn is that I need to hone in on these feelings of existential distress as much as I can and really amplify them so that people become aware that I need something. And so what tends to naturally crop up as an adult is that feeling of panic, stress, and the need to alert someone to your panic and distress so that they can soothe you, because this is the model that you have internalized based on what worked to keep you alive and mitigate that existential distress for you from a very, very young age. Now, for those on the avoidant side of the spectrum, what often happened is that your physical needs may have been met when you were young, but your emotional needs were likely relatively consistently not met in an adequate sense. And so what the brain naturally learns to do in order to stay in connection with the caregiver, which is vital for survival at a young age, was to kind of numb out the feelings of pain that are associated with certain emotional states. Because if you can disregard those feelings in your own mind, it means that you will not express the appropriate emotions around them. Ergo, you will not upset your caregiver, who may not be able to handle you expressing emotions around anything other than direct physical needs. And then as an adult, what happens when something goes wrong in life and that kind of existential dread creeps into your worldview? You find ways to numb out, dissociate, or disconnect from that pain without even realizing you are doing it. So, all of this is to say, our early attachment systems and the way that they wire us early on in life set the stage for how we will deal with existential distress, so the threat of loss in any capacity, when we are adults. So most of us, as we go through life, have these instinctive feelings of what the right thing to do is and what the wrong thing to do is. And the reason those things feel so instinctual are because they are probably the things that kept you in the good graces of the people who were caring for you in your early environment. And so they quite literally come from an instinctual place. So if from a young age I learned that the thing that keeps me in the good graces of my caregivers is repressing my vulnerable emotions and not burdening other people with my negative feelings, then I start to believe as I grow up that is the right, good, and moral thing to do. One should always deal with their own problems, not burden other people, and people who do play the victim and burden other people, you might judge as morally bad or pathetic in some capacity. And on the flip side, if what consistently worked for you growing up was amplifying and focusing in and sharing your emotions with others, you might start to instinctively feel that co-regulation and sharing vulnerably with people is always the right and good and moral thing to do. And those who repress and deny their emotions and don't connect emotionally with others are the people who you might see as morally bad in some capacity. So to be insecurely attached, by definition, is to have a one-sided experience of our own psychology and morality. This is not intentional and we do not choose it. However, by definition of what it means to be insecurely attached, we are omitting large swaths of information that is relevant to attachment relationships as we go through life. So that could be, on the anxious side of the spectrum, ways in which we are actually capable of self-regulating and meeting our own needs. Or on the avoidant side of the spectrum, it could be ways in which we are actually quite weak, vulnerable, and in need of help from others. But the important part here is that those things exist in our shadow. We are not consciously aware of those needs. We are not consciously aware of the things that we are omitting from our own moral code that we use to navigate the world. And often, we don't truly have to face any of that until, for some reason or another, we end up encountering our shadow. Often what leads people to do shadow work at whatever point in their life is because they reach a point where they realize that their lives are not working, and the parts of their lives that are causing the problem are emerging from a psychological blind spot. And if we are lucky, and I truly mean this because it gives us the chance to reorganize our worldview into a secure one if we take it, we are able to recognize that some aspect of the way that we've been existing in the world and the moral code as we hold it includes an accidental outward projection of the exact opposite of what we believe we want to be putting into the world. So let's talk in more concrete terms about what that means. According to Jung, every time there is a one-sided action that is taken at the directive of the conscious mind, which is a fancy way of saying every time we do something that is motivated by the conscious thought of, let's say, this and only this is the right thing to do, there is a counteraction that occurs in the shadow. So if I identify in my conscious mind as a people pleaser or as a person who always sacrifices what I want for others, I might have something that I actually want quite badly for myself, but my system of morality that I've consciously constructed based on what worked to keep me reasonably safe and protected as a child, if that system of morality dictates that I must always put others' needs ahead of my own, what I might consciously do is acquiesce to the needs of others, but the rage that I might feel in my body that my conscious mind tells me it is not okay to feel, because a good person would not feel anger at putting others' needs above their own, that anger goes into my shadow. Or let's say that I have the worldview that I must always be strong and invulnerable so that I do not put my needs on other people. So every time I take an action that is motivated by that system of morality, the true fear and vulnerability and need for comfort that I feel in that scenario gets projected into my shadow. When something is in our shadow, it means that we now have a need we are experiencing that we are not consciously aware of. So if I have a whole bunch of vulnerability and sadness and grief in my shadow, because my conscious mind tells me I'm a tough person, I'm resilient, I don't feel pain over petty things, that pain still wants to exist in the world. It wants to see itself actualized. So if somebody hurts me in a relationship and I can't admit even to myself that I'm hurt, what I'm gonna do is start finding ways unconsciously to start putting that person down, to make them feel lesser than, and to get them to act out the pain that I am unable to access consciously in myself. So by denying my own woundedness, I end up finding ways to get other people to act out that woundedness for me without me realizing I am doing that. And the same can be said of, let's say, people pleasing. If I am consciously putting aside what I want and giving someone else what they want, and I'm unable to recognize even to myself that I'm angry about that, I might end up behaving in passive-aggressive ways without even being aware that I'm doing that. And what happens when we behave passive-aggressively for long enough? Eventually, the other person tends to get angry and frustrated. And so now the anger that we repressed into our shadow is being acted out by the other person who we are behaving passive-aggressively towards. So again, our anger has found a way to exist in the world because we have projected it outward and kind of given it to someone else to act out by virtue of the fact that we are repressing it. So this is kind of deep into the field of transactional analysis, which looks at how people make adaptations based on how each one is showing up in the relationship. But very often when we have a lot of repressed stuff in our shadow, we end up being partnered with people or being very close to people who act out that which is in our shadow. And this can be a key indication if you feel like you keep dating the same types of people over and over again who have behavior that you absolutely abhor, that type of behavior is the thing you have to confront in your own shadow if you want to stop encountering it in other people. Now, I want to be really clear. What I am not saying is you are causing everybody's behavior and nobody has any autonomy over their own behavior. But often, even if that projection process isn't completely happening, we very often feel drawn to those who have the traits that we repress in ourselves. And then later on, we might end up hating them for those exact traits that are just a different expression of that which instinctively drew us to them. Now, a lot of people never encounter a crisis of meaning as a result of this. Many people go through life having a ton of projections, getting really angry at other people for the traits that they have disidentified with inside of themselves, and in many capacities finding a way to kind of set up a life for themselves where they don't have to confront that which is in the shadow. But for a variety of potential reasons, other people end up having to confront their shadow and facing the dark night of the soul. So something that kind of kickstarted the shadow work process for myself was when I had what I now see as the gift, but it did not feel like a gift at the time, of meeting my own shadow very deeply inside of somebody else. So for the majority of my young life, my worldview was one of self-responsibility. I was raised in a very traditionally German household where the most noble thing you could do was suck up your own feelings, not put them on anybody else, and if you had a strong feeling that was not directly tied to some sort of very practical or physical threat, the kind thing to do was to accept that you were being irrational, to shove that feeling down and to not put it on anybody else. Now, this worldview was one that I inherited from my parent, who inherited it from their parent, and there was never a conscious decision made at any point in my lineage that I am aware of that this was the right way to be. It was just what I internalized because it was what generations of people before me and my family had also internalized and passed down, believing they were teaching proper morals to their children. So when I grew up, I would frequently try to have close relationships with people, only to become offended and frustrated when they would express any strong negative emotions they had that weren't directly related to their survival needs. I would be like, look, I'm over here doing all of the hard work of keeping myself emotionally regulated by recognizing that when a strong feeling comes up that isn't tied to one of my survival needs, I'm being irrational, and I expect everybody else to be doing the same. And if they don't, I'm going to let them know that I think they're being irrational, and that all this kind of drama they're creating around their emotions isn't good for them, or for me, or for our relationship, because again, that was opposite to my own moral code. And of course, the problem here is that when we are insecurely attached, and we are one-sided in some capacity when it comes to our moral code, we tend to get close to people who are one-sided in the opposite way. So I was over here going, the right thing to do is to suppress your emotions and not express them. And then I would find someone who believed that the right thing to do was always express and co-regulate around your feelings, no matter how intense they are, and without a lot of regard for how the way you're expressing your emotions impacts the other person. So it was generally really easy for both me and whoever I was close with to point at each other and go, you are the problem. And in every case, we were both right. Both of our systems of morality were missing something crucial. However, I wanted to get off the merry-go-round and I didn't know how yet. So I figured, what if I just date someone who's exactly like me? What if I get close to another person who, like myself, believes in total self-responsibility, believes that we are all completely responsible for our own feelings and reactions, and who, for the most part, sees large dramatic displays of emotion as childish and unnecessary. So the universe granted me with someone who had a very similar cultural background to me, a very similar internal set of morals around solving all of one's emotional problems oneself, and I started to feel absolutely insane being close to this person. When I would express something like pain or distress over something they had said to me and got the kind of response in return that I would often give to others, implying that I was being irrational, I started to log just how painful that felt. And this, I want to be clear, is one of two experiences you could have. Often, on the other side of the spectrum, when an anxious person meets someone who becomes more anxiously attached to them than vice versa, there's a feeling of disgust and contempt that comes very quickly online, because again, you are seeing yourself mirrored in that other person. And when we have ourselves mirrored back to ourselves in this way, when we have what I believe is truly the opportunity to meet the energy that we approach the world with in another person, and notice how we are affected by that, we are being given the opportunity to understand and experience the shadow that we are casting on the world, often completely unknowingly. And we can take such an opportunity and do one of two things. We can decide, once again, that the problem is 100% the other person, find ways to convince ourselves, actually, I'm nothing like them, and go on our merry way and choose different people who don't force us to confront ourselves in that same way to be close with. Or we can do the hard work, whether we stay in relationship with that other or not, of admitting to ourselves that if I am showing up in the same way this person is, and the way that this person is showing up is causing me immense pain to interface with, I must be causing others and myself that same pain without recognizing it. Even though the actions that I'm taking that are leading to this are things that I have always believed to be the morally correct actions. Now I'm faced with counter evidence. And what you do in the face of that counter evidence determines whether you will confront your shadow or continue to go on behaving the way you've always behaved and casting it onto the world. If you choose the path of confronting your shadow, it is highly likely you're going to experience a dark night of the soul. So your systems of morality and how you make sense of the world and what you believe to be the right way to navigate the world, as well as your personal sense of identity. So the person you believe yourself to be, the traits you believe yourself to have, and the traits you believe yourself to absolutely not have are going to collapse in on themselves. If I believe that denying my own vulnerability, remaining resilient and rejecting of the parts of myself that are weak and needy is the right thing to do, and then I learn that those weak, needy parts of myself are actually things I am accidentally projecting left, right, and center and putting out into the world, I now have to face the fact that by consciously disidentifying with parts of myself, I am accidentally creating more of that thing in the world in a less healthy way. Same goes from the opposite side of the spectrum. If I believe that forgoing my own wants and needs and only catering to what other people want and need is the absolute most moral way to exist in the world, and then I learn that actually my own disowned wants, needs, fears, anxieties that come up are being felt secondhand by my partner, and they are starting to feel responsible for caretaking me around that, I'm actually creating more unhappiness for them by not owning what I want than I would be if I simply set some boundaries and found ways to get what I want for myself in the first place, rather than pushing them under the rug and then my partner having to indirectly grapple with them down the line. But here's the cool thing about the dark night of the soul. For the first time in our lives, if we came to it from a place of insecure attachment, we are being offered the opportunity to see reality clearly. The defining characteristic of insecure attachment is that there are significant distortions in your worldview when it comes to the way you look at attachment relationships, which is a clinical way of saying in some way you are not in touch with reality. Between yourself and the existential void of pain and anxiety, you have placed a whole bunch of stories and distortions that have kept you from seeing the nature of reality clearly. When we arrive in reality, we understand, the way that those who were raised secure naturally understand, that all of us have the entire emotional spectrum available to us, and almost every day we feel the entire range of the emotional spectrum, just not consciously. Every single one of us feels anger more or less daily. Every single one of us feels vulnerable and weak and needy pretty much daily. Every single one of us feels lustful and like there are things we deeply want just for ourselves on a pretty much daily basis. All of these feelings that we may have almost no conscious awareness of are nonetheless happening for us every single day. And there is a very simple explanation as to why that is happening, because our biology is oriented towards survival. Right? There is no moral flaw in feeling any of the things we feel. Now, of course, there are certain feelings we might choose not to act on because it would not be pro-social. And by pro-social, I mean it would not allow us to exist in harmony with other beings. So if I feel murderous rage, owning that impulse does not mean I go commit murder. It could just mean owning that I feel really angry. And what I choose to do with that anger is a different story. But where the real problems come into play is when we try to convince ourselves that we don't have these feelings we have in the first place. Whether those feelings are anger, joy, disgust, rage, selfishness, vulnerability, all of us have the entire gamut. That's just what it is to be human. And the feelings that we have are natural responses to being alive. So feeling anything is not a moral failing. It's just a natural biological response to our environments. And for a lot of us, it takes deeply confronting our shadow to actually understand that, and to be able to finally see ourselves in an undistorted way. Now, when Jung talks about the dark night of the soul, he talks about a point where you realize that all of these projections you've been putting out into the world, you now have to rein in and recognize that these are all reflections of states and emotions that exist inside of you. The super strong, super resilient, tough guy has to recognize his own weakness, lest he endlessly project it outwards and force other people to act it out for him. The people pleaser has to acknowledge their own selfishness and their own wants and desires, lest they endlessly project those things outwards and inadvertently make other people responsible for satisfying their unfulfilled needs for them. The deep irony of shadow work is that by recognizing what it is we have repressed and neglected in ourselves, we actually become more morally well-rounded people through the integration of those things. But first, it can feel like a total disorientation of our identity, our sense of self, and our sense of morality. Like Eckhart Tolle describes it, a collapse of the perceived meaning of life. The old map that we had for navigating the world no longer applies, and we have to figure out a new one. There's a quote by Cheryl Strayed that I absolutely love that goes, "It is impossible for you to go on as you were before, so you must go on as you never have." And I think that this is such an apt quote for navigating the dark night of the soul. Once we see that all of these things we've been projecting outward into the world and hating and scorning and judging other people for doing and feeling and expressing are the things that we have been repressing inside of ourselves, we cannot unsee that. There is not a way back into our old patterns of judgment and coping and moralizing. We have to develop a new moral code, a new means of understanding the world, and a new way of integrating both our logical, rational, invulnerable selves, and our sensitive, vulnerable, emotional ones. Another phenomenal Jung quote that fits this occasion is the quote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." If I'm angry, it's probably because I perceive some sort of threat or boundary violation, and it serves me to pay attention to that anger and use it as information about where I need to be setting my boundaries. If I feel vulnerable and hurt, that is probably giving me good information about some sort of care, support, or soothing that I'm in need of. And I can use that information to figure out which types of relationships I can invest in where that type of mutual support is a normal part of it. Sometimes that might mean confronting the ways in which I am hurting other people, and these kind of cycles of hurt that I have not been able to recognize my own role in prior to this point, but now I can. And so I can actually get down to the bottom in a real way of why things are playing out the way that they are. Doesn't mean every relationship is going to get salvaged, but it does mean our clarity increases tenfold. We no longer have to make everybody else wrong to feel like we are okay when they are behaving in a way that we would not behave. So to bring this back to attachment for a minute, one of the ongoing education classes that I'm currently taking is teaching me to code adult attachment interviews. So to take an adult attachment interview and to be able to discern which attachment strategy that person is employing by analyzing the language that they use. And a kind of tidbit I found fascinating within this course was that one of my professors made a comment kind of offhandedly at one point that it's not uncommon for people who are in the attachment healing process, so who are in the process of moving from an insecure worldview towards a secure one, to experience a period of depression in relation to their view of attachment relationships. Now, two things this doesn't mean. One, it doesn't mean that everybody is going to experience that, and two, it doesn't mean that your depression pervades every area of your life. This is specific to the way that people view attachment relationships. And the reason this happens, why you might move through this period of depression in your thinking about attachment relationships as you're in the healing process, is because there's a specific point where you're able to kind of see your own shadow. You reach a point where you're able to see clearly all of these things that you're doing that are not getting you the closeness and the intimacy or the ability to navigate the world completely independently of close attachment relationships by using the strategy you have always used. So you might reach a point where essentially you see your own patterning laid out clearly, you understand that it is not going to get you what you want, and yet you don't yet have the secure skills you need to start behaving differently. So it can feel kind of hopeless, like I no longer know who I am or how I can show up in relationships in a way that gets me what I want, and maybe I even see now the ways in which I'm contributing to my own misery. But I have not yet developed whatever skills I need to do something differently. So this period of depression can be a normal stage in the healing process. And what needs to come next is that confrontation and integration of the shadow, which starts with accepting that you can no longer go on as you were. If I truly accept that there is no way for me to completely numb out the pain that is inherent to being a mortal being who experiences loss and the threat of loss in life, and I know that I cannot elicit a perfect savior who will come along and forever abolish my distress, what would I need to learn to do instead? So there's a spiritual teacher named Michael Beckwith who I was watching a video of the other day, and he was saying, if you are experiencing the dark night of the soul, the most fruitful question you can ask yourself is the question, if this experience were to last forever, what quality would have to emerge for me to have peace of mind? So this kind of flips the framing of how do I avoid this pain on its head. And instead it goes, look, you are here in this place where for the first time you are understanding that no one is coming to save you and you cannot numb out your feelings of pain forever. Life is inherently uncertain, constantly in flux. People in our lives, relationships, situations come and go, and there's really not much we can do to control all that or to pretend that we don't feel the pain of it. Now, the opportunity that we've been given is to learn the skills of accepting that that is the true nature of reality and learning to cope with it by accessing our entire emotional range. So for a lot of people, this might look like taking on some new philosophy or finding new teachers or mentors or communities who can help them develop the skills that are necessary for embracing the chaotic nature of life without going absolutely mad. So the question becomes, if I am in this dark night of the soul, and it kind of feels like I am lost in the wilderness, instead of fixating on how I find my way out, how do I accept that I am here? And that this unknown wilderness, this existential void that I've unconsciously been trying to escape my awareness of for my entire life, is now my home. What skills do I need to make this home feel like a place that I would want to live in? If I don't know how to deal with my feelings of vulnerability now that I have them in my conscious awareness, who might be able to teach me how to deal with those? If I don't know how to deal with my anger or my rage, what type of help could I elicit that might guide me in the right direction? How do I develop the tools for dealing with reality as it is, rather than continuing to distort it and tell myself stories about myself and the world that are largely one-sided in nature? And this is both how we navigate through the dark night of the soul and how we heal our attachment systems. We find that blend between dignity and humility, and we learn to live there. And like anything, this is a long process that we will in some part be engaging with for the rest of our lives. But I want to be clear, to arrive here is absolutely a gift because it gives us the opportunity to have a life full of deep, meaningful experiences and connections because they are all grounded in what's true. Okay, I think I'm going to end this video there for today because it is getting quite lengthy. But as always, leave any thoughts, feelings, perspectives, whatever is coming up for you in the comments section. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children. And I will see you back here again really soon.